welcome. And thank you for joining us for this episode of our Mason Frank Salesforce Success Podcast on sustainability.
Excellent.
So it'd be great if you could just kind of introduce yourself a little bit and also and Greenly, if that's okay, Alexis.
Yeah, my pleasure. So I'm Alexis Normand. I'm French. I live in Paris. I'm 41. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Greenly. And what Greenly is essentially a carbon accounting platform that aims to reduce the barrier to entry so that any company, even very small ones, can start their climate journey. So essentially making the task of collecting the data to compute your emissions way easier thanks to technology. And the reason you want to do this is because if you want companies to really take part in the global emission reduction pathway that will get us to net zero, hopefully by 2050, well, you have to have a massification, essentially, of companies starting this. And so you have to train them. You have to make it easy for them to get started. You have to be good enough for the analysis to really help you decarbonize. And of course, that's what we're focusing on every day.
Oh, fantastic! That sounds very exciting. Okay, well, what's the impact of sustainability as kind of a quick overview, if that's okay?
Sure. So, I mean, sustainability means a lot of things to a lot of different things to a lot of people. Of course, it includes your impact on climate, but you could legitimately say that it also includes your impact on biodiversity, hazardous waste, water supply, and there's even a broader definition of that, which includes societal impact, and governance. And these are all very important things. But when it comes to Greenly, we are essentially focused on climate, and so specifically on carbon emissions. So the impact of a company on climate change, which is essentially measured in number of kilograms or tons of CO2 equivalent being that unifying metric where all the greenhouse gases like methane, are translated into a single metric just to make it simple for people to understand their impact. So this is our sweet spot, so to speak.
Excellent. Okay, fantastic. Leading on to kind of the next point, I mean, what data is key to improving levels of sustainability at work?
A way to think about, again, climate disclosure and GHG emissions is how is it, in total for a firm, but to make it more easier to understand, you often break it down by headcount. So you look at a company's carbon intensity by employees, and on average, maybe your work is like 5 tons of CO2 per employee a year, which is about like 5 plane tickets from London to New York, and back. So just to give and so obviously a lot is due to the global impact of the company on like energy consumption, electricity consumption, supply chain, but a big part is also linked to the work of employees. And so when you look at employees' contribution to their company's carbon footprint, there are 3 or 4 main buckets. The first one is employees commuting to work. So people don't usually think of this as a part of a company's carbon footprint, but it is, in fact. So if you ride a bike to work every day, or if you work from home with a Zoom or other video conference thing, it doesn't have the same impact at all as if you take your SUV to go to work, basically, for a very long distance, and just because the energy spend there is very different. So a company can influence that, right? Based on its remote work policy, based on its policy on, say, supporting employees getting bikes and so on. or biking parks. But that's bucket number one. It's the commuting. Another one in transport is, of course, the actual work-related travel, which is slightly different. So if you're going to a business meeting by plane, certain types of companies, services company, they have the travel as one of the biggest source of emissions, consultancies, for instance. So all these guys moving to hotels and having like these important flight travels and so on. So that's bucket number two. There are two other buckets which people think of a little less. One is actually the nutrition aspect. So you're going to be eating anyway, right? But you could say that when your employer is organizing the way employees are able to eat, they actually have an influence on this. So what you eat in the school canteen can be hugely impactful in terms of carbon footprint. If it's meat every day, it's not the same thing as a weekly vegetarian meal, and you don't want to be imposing anything on anyone, but you do want to give the option to reduce your work-related emissions, right? And then there's a last interesting bucket, which people think of even less, which is your IT footprint. IT footprint is actually a big bucket in itself. So it's things like equipment mostly. So if you have a cell phone that comes with your work, a computer, of course. So the type of machines that you offer employees have very different footprints. You have a scale of 1 to 5 from one computer to another. And then beyond the machines itself, but which is usually the biggest bucket, it's what you do with those. So the more data intensive your usage of IT equipments, the more data centers use up electricity. So anyway, I've been a little exhaustive here, but you can actually break this down quite well and rather simply, and that's one of the things that we do, by the way, at Greenly.
Oh, fantastic. No, it's interesting to hear the comparisons there with all the different kind of buckets, as you mentioned. And I guess in terms of how sustainable a firm is in general, I mean, is this now a driver to move jobs? I mean, what are the kind of the three initiatives that firms can adopt to kind of hit that net zero?
Yeah, for sure. So the work-related emissions are usually not the biggest bucket when you look at the overall emissions, but the fact that you raise awareness among your employees is absolutely critical to sustaining the long-term commitment of the company to decarbonization, right? I mean, reducing emissions is completely doable, right? It's usually recommended to do it between 5 and 10% a year, and that's achievable, right? If you understand where they come from, but it is hard work and it's easy to give up. And so if there's no internal support for it, it's much harder. The last thing you want is a ESG manager like being isolated and almost derided for like being a pain in the neck for many people. So that's one aspect of it, and employees have different levels of awareness. So you have, and it's kind of a generational divide here. You have people who haven't thought too much about it during their lifetime. Older employees. Of course, not all of them, but some tend to be a little more skeptical, not necessarily on the fact that climate change is a real thing, but on the urgency. And then, of course, younger people have much more eco-anxiety, right? They're going to be living in a world which could be significantly less, more difficult, significantly more difficult. So now, when you look at this problem from a recruitment perspective, from the putting yourself in the shoes of an employer, it's becoming harder and harder to recruit talent if you essentially don't convey the message that you are serious about this. And that's different from one sector to another, but we've seen that in tech companies that tend to have much younger workers, if they don't have a sustainability strategy, nobody wants to work there. You've probably seen that there are a lot of student lobbies, activists who are castigating a lot of companies for not doing enough or for going in the opposite direction of decarbonization. And so for these guys, it's become increasingly hard to recruit talent. And it's forcing them to change, in fact. So I think young graduates, students, people who are choosing their first job is a hugely important lobby and force of change, for sure.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you very much. Okay. What small steps can individuals make in the Salesforce ecosystem to have a positive impact on this?
Yeah. So the first step is educating yourself, educating others. So I think the awareness component is very important. There are lots of very good training out there, climate workshops that kind of summarize the conclusions of the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right? But then to actually, so spreading the word is important, but in terms of actual reduction, well, if you look at the buckets, right, of course, so think of a pie chart of where complete a country's emissions are. The first bucket in most countries is transportation. So if you switch to low energy mobility, essentially, that has a huge impact. So taking the tube rather than taking your car, taking a bike rather than taking a car, and so an electric bike or an electric car if you afford it and you can't do without a car because you're in some remote area. But there's an increasingly important number of alternatives and options to really decarbonize. So it's harder and harder to find excuses for riding very energy intensive cars for daily purposes, and I'm not trying to judge, I'm answering the question, how do you reduce? So that 30% of a country's emission are typically around transport. So you can fly less as well. We're not necessarily saying stop everything you're doing, but think of carbon like you would think of calories. You don't have to stop eating ice cream altogether, right? But you don't have to eat 5 ice creams every day. So it's the same idea. So start counting and start reducing. So transport, we talked, so housing tends to be around 25%. So housing is heating, it's heating. So, that's harder for individuals because you have to invest in isolation. So this is more a structural thing, but you can wear a sweater, rather than heating at 21 degrees Celsius or 25 in winter. You can switch to 19. And I'm not necessarily recommending taking cold showers in winter, but some people do it, right? Nutrition is typically 25% of your emissions, or 25, depends. And the weight of red meat tends to be half of that. So the single most effective thing that you can do to reduce your personal emissions is to eat less meat. And again, I'm not saying let's be crazy about this and stop everything altogether. There are lots of people who are already at that point, but I think if that were the message, we discuss a lot of people, and it's a transition. It's not a radical change that we are recommending. But you can glorify having red meat once a week or once a month, or why not once a year. But having red meat every day definitely makes your nutrition, your CO2 footprint of nutrition really, really high. And then last but not least, your daily consumption of all types of consumer goods, right? We talked about phones and high tech and so on. So here again, there's a strong current of low tech people who think you don't need as much, but I think what's reasonable for most people is what I'm looking for. In which case, it's probably, I mean, certainly about choosing circularity options. So a phone, you don't have to change your phone every year. They're pretty good now, right? They've been pretty good for a while. So
Yeah.
you can actually keep a phone for 5 years, I think, maybe more.
Yeah.
And that's also where you can buy refurbished phones because they do break down sometimes, et cetera, et cetera. So, and think about refurbished goods or circular goods. And by the way, that's a big business trend, right? There are lots of companies now offering more sustainable options. And I mean, that's definitely part of those small steps that will improve your overall impact as an individual. And then individuals are citizens, right, as well. So that's maybe the last part, where they should also be holding companies accountable for their impact, which I think is perhaps also a very influential lever here.
I guess kind of lastly from my side, I mean, what are your predictions for the next 5 years? I guess within Greenly, and then also just in general around sustainability.
Today, we're serving about 1,500 customers. We believe we have probably the most scalable tech platform to serve lots of SMB mid-market companies. We're actually enterprise grade on the back end, but consumer grade on the front end. So our goal is not to serve 10,000, but maybe 100,000 or 1 million companies. So it's really about making this as easy as possible for a huge number of companies to get started. So that obviously requires a lot of product sophistication, but actually simplification as well. Building an important sales function. You know, we are a business. But so that's for Greenly. But I think if you take a higher level view, you're also looking at a space where regulations are kicking in to push practically all companies to start tracking their emissions. Today, it's about 25% of global emissions being tracked and managed. We need to get to 100%. And I think in the next 5 years, we'll probably get to 60%, 70%. So it's a massive expansion of something people weren't really doing before. So think of it like everyone has a financial software stack in a company. Everyone will now also have an extra financial software stack. And that's, I mean, that's a massive change actually in how companies are going to be looking at their performance. And it has started in Europe. It is coming to the US. California adopted yesterday a bill to push that type of accounting, and you're going to see this more and more. And beyond accounting, what this is actually going to lead to is kind of like a climate rating of how mature companies are on their decarbonization, knowing that today you have a lot of ESG ratings, and many investors, the financial markets, the bankers, they take this into account in how they allocate capital and how they finance things. But the thing is, the climate, the carbon element, and going back to our initial point in this conversation, is very much diluted in the broader sustainability metrics. So you can have a great ESG rating and still be an oil company, basically, and drilling oils and adding a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. So what you're going to see emerge very quickly is actually a carbon-only rating, so a climate pathway rating, which will, I think, be very useful in helping markets allocate capital towards the energy transition. And this is definitely a key driver of acceleration. We absolutely need this, and obviously it's also something at Greenly that we are working on.
Fantastic. No, thank you very much for giving a thorough overview there, Alexis. Some really interesting points to take away there for our viewers, actually. So yeah, thank you very much for your time on our podcast today.
Sure.
Anything else to add from your side?
No, I think your questions were great. Just well, if any of the viewers, enjoyed this conversation, we are growing fast, so they shouldn't hesitate to reach out directly. So I'll give you my email, Alexis, Alexis @greenly.earth, and they're welcome to reach out.
Perfect. Thanks very much for your time today, Alexis.
My pleasure.